In Raid Shadow Legends, you're generally going to be focusing the higher rarities, the epics, the legendaries, and the mythicals. But one thing that you don't want to fall into is avoiding rares. Rares in this game can be incredibly powerful, and there are some rares in this game which are frankly better than a lot of legendaries. So here is all of the rares that you need to take into account when you're starting the game, when you're later in the game. These are just basically all of the rares that you should consider saving, consider using, or just look at for a little longer than you normally would. So with one exception, which I will start with, these rares are just going to be loosely in order. I'm going to go faction by faction. And if there's anyone that I miss, please leave them in the comments down below. At the end of the day, I can't cover everyone. But to start off, let's go with the best rare in the game by far, Coldheart. Coldheart is so good to the point where you want to keep 2 to 3 copies. And yeah, she's freaking disgustingly good. So first of all, Coldheart is a void rare. She's a little bit harder to pull, but she's really, really good. So she's well worth it. Her A1 is solid. It hits 4 times, really good for Fire Knight with all of the hits. And the hits have a chance of placing heal reduction for 2 turns, which is amazing, especially for Fire Knight and even some other areas. Then her A2, which is her worst ability, but still is okay, attacks all enemies, has a chance of placing decreased accuracy, and places a poison debuff for 2 turns if the target is already under a heal reduction debuff, which combos with her A1. But the reason why Coldheart is the best rare in the game, by far, since the game has really come out, she's been the best, it is because of this A3. This A3 is a 4-turn cooldown. It hits only 1 enemy, but it does 2 really, really important things. One is it decreases the target's turn meter by 100%. This is really good against a ton of things, especially certain bosses. Spider comes to mind, Fire Knight once again comes to mind. There's so many other things where this is, applicable. And then it also has an extra chance of inflicting a critical hit. But the main reason why this is so good as well, or the second reason why this is so good, is damage increases according to enemy max HP. Enemy max HP scaling abilities in this game are some of the best abilities to have. Whenever someone has an enemy max HP scaling ability, they become so much better. There's a lot of bosses in this game, a lot of bosses. So you just need to do a bunch of damage, and this is what that does. If you're looking to have one of the strongest possible starts, make sure to click the link in the description to get a free legendary Bambus 4-leaf and one of the best epics in the game, Dagor, as you level up. Now, to make it happen, here are all the steps you need to follow. Number 1, make sure you are logged out of Plarium Play on PC, or you just don't have it installed at all. The next step, you just gotta go into the description, click the link, and register with a brand new email. Once you launch Raid and complete the tutorial, go to the mail, and there sitting will be your free legendary, and the epic will come soon after once you hit level 15. Starts like this in gachas are unheard of. Click my link right now and get the start that you deserve. Coldheart nukes things. She reduces the cooldown, or not the cooldown. She reduces the turn meter down to nothing. She is insane. Keep a couple Coldhearts. Now let's go in order from factions. A lot of these are just going to be more early based. I will obviously evaluate as we go. The first one for Bannerlords, and really the only rare that I think is worth mentioning, is the Dagger. She's a little bit of turn meter decrease on the A1. She has a 75% AoE big version decreased defense on a 3-turn cooldown on her A2. You're going to see someone a little bit later, which is a lot easier to get, have a 100% for something like this, but this is at the end of the day a decent ability. And then she also has a decreased attack. If there's already a decreased defense on the opponent, then it'll be a big decreased attack, otherwise it'll be a small version, 3-turn cooldown, and only 1 enemy. She's solid, she brings a couple things you need for quite a few pieces of content, but the thing is she falls off really hard, and the second you get an epic that's better, she will fall off pretty hard. But she's good for a rare. Now, moving on to High Elves, we get to a top 5 rare in the game, which is Apothecary. Apothecary has always been really strong, especially early on when you do not have a lot of speed units. Speed is king in this game. Speed is the most important stat, the most important thing, which also makes filling the turn meter of your allies and decreasing turn meter of your enemies equally as important. So he fills the turn meter of all allies by 15%, as well as a big version increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. And then he also brings a really solid heal, which can be critical, which is a 2-turn cooldown, which is really fast. And then his A1 is 3 times at random. He does a lot of things. He's great for early arena. He's great for really everything early on. He can heal you. He can keep you guys going. And he will get power crept later when you get better options. Like Deacon Armstrong is someone that comes to mind, which is better. You know, Arbiter, when you get her, will be better for speed. But at the end of the day, for what he brings early on, he is amazing. And even later on in the game, you're going to get a lot of use out of his A1 for something like Fire Knight. I know I keep mentioning Fire Knight, but these units are pretty solid there. Apothecary is a must keep. Elhain I'm not really going to talk about too much because she's a starter champ, but just know all of the starter champs are solid for early DPS. Eris is also pretty decent. She can grant an extra turn if the target is killed, but that's not really why you use her. Remove a random debuff from all allies, solid, and has a 100% when booked chance of placing a big version increased speed on all allies for 2 turns. Like I said, really important to have. She also counterattacks the attacker when an ally is attacked, allowing her to get a bunch of hits off, which is pretty solid. And then she also has ally speed in dungeon. She is farmable and honestly pretty solid. Reliquary Tender also comes to mind. She's one of the best rare revivers in the game. There's one more that I will be mentioning later, which might be debatably better, but it depends on your perspective. Reliquary Tender's main thing is revive an ally with 30% HP and fills their turn meter by 30%. It is on a 5-turn cooldown. This is pretty solid. Now the A2 is also removes all debuffs from all allies, places a 15% continuous heal buff on them for 2 turns. A full debuff cleanse is really rare for epics and rares, so this is really good. And then she also can put out decrease attack. She's a very solid support. Prosecutor is okay, but I'm not really going to mention him too much. In Sacred Order, really the only one to mention is Aethel, so we'll move on to Barbarians. Barbarians has 2 very solid rares. War Maiden, which is farmable, and you should be farming her as soon as you can. War Maiden's main thing is this. It is a 3-turn cooldown, 100% guaranteed chance of placing a 60% big version decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. This is amazing. If you do not have something like Ugo, which is an epic that's, you know, an upgraded version of this where they're putting out decreased defense, or you get, you know, a different epic or a different legendary to put out decreased defense, you're gonna need to have War Maiden. War Maiden does get power crept, but having an AoE 100% chance on a 3-turn cooldown at decreased defense is so astronomically important, especially early on, that you have to go for War Maiden. You have to have a War Maiden. That's just how it goes. She's also okay. She can, you know, attack an enemy, place an increased attack on her, extra hit if it's critical. You know, she does some other things. Poison's kind of nice, but at the end of the day, it's all about that A3. The other one that is worth mentioning though is Soulspawned Boyar. Soulspawned Boyar is really good, specifically in a stun set. Her A1 is attacks all enemies, put her in a stun set, she's stunning people all the time, extra chance of inflicting critical hit. She can also, you know, she can also ignore defense with the A2, and then the A3 has a chance of depleting the target's turn meter by 100%. She does love to read, but rares, honestly, it's not that big of a deal if they need to read because the rare books are so easy to get in this game. But basically, Soulspawned Boyar is amazing. She'll help you in quite a few areas, especially Doom Tower whenever you need to use rare units. She's pretty damn solid. Now moving on to the Ogryn Tribes. I don't think there's anyone really that I want to mention apart from... Actually, no, there are a couple. First of all, I want to mention Bellower. Bellower is really solid. He has a ton of AoE attacks. Attacks all enemies, has a chance of placing a block active skills debuff. Attacks all enemies has a chance of placing decreased speed debuff. And attacks all enemies, chance of placing a decreased attack and defense. He is really solid. You could also build him in a stun set. He does a solid amount of damage. Constant AoEs all the time. Very solid, and increase ally speed and faction crypts. You're probably going to use them in factions unless you pull some better units. And as far as I remember, Ogryn Tribes doesn't have, you know, the best units in its faction. It has some really good ones, but it has some really not good ones. So Bellower really comes to mind. And also Gear Grinder is pretty solid, mainly for this. He's one of the only revivers in this faction, which is great for faction trials. 5-turn cooldown, restores a dead ally or revives a dead ally with 50% HP, 50% turn meter, and has a heal on 3-turn cooldown. He's pretty solid. Lizardman doesn't really have anyone worth mentioning, so we go on to Skinwalkers. Skinwalkers, the only one I will mention is Gnarlhorn. Gnarlhorn is also farmable, which is really cool. And the main reason you use him is because he has a 3-turn cooldown, AoE provoke, which is really, really rare to have. You're not really going to need this too badly early on, but when you do start to need it, he'll be really, really clutch. He also puts an unkillable buff on him on a 3-turn cooldown, which is really good. So we move on to Orcs, and Orcs, I mean, also don't have any good rares, so I would avoid basically everyone in there. Moving on to Demon Spawn, there are actually quite a few good ones. Starting with a farmable rare, Diabolist is a very solid turn meter manipulator. We have filled turn meter of all allies by 15%, decreases turn meter of all enemies on a 4-turn cooldown, really good ability. And she also has an attack all enemies, place a big version increase speed on all allies for 2 turns, 3-turn cooldown. Speed is king in this game. You want to have a speed manipulator. Diabolist got you if you don't have anyone else. She is farmable at the end of the day. Felhound is also worth mentioning. He does a lot of damage with his AoE ability. Really good for campaign farming. He'll clear the waves like nothing once you get to a certain point where you have the gear to do it, and he's pretty solid. Marquess also has really solid multipliers, I think. She hits pretty hard. Worth an honorable mention there. Moving on to Undead Hordes. Realistically, there's not too many people in here, but someone that is worth mentioning is Frozen Banshee. Frozen Banshee is really good for clan boss. She does really solid damage. She has poison sensitivity, which essentially makes your poisons do more damage. And then she has a small turn meter fill, but you don't really use this ability because of her A1. Attack an enemy 2 times. Each hit has a 100% chance of placing a poison debuff as long as the target is under poison sensitivity, which she's putting out pretty damn often. So she's going to be putting out a ton of poisons, doing a ton of damage, and that's really all you need for clan boss when you're talking about a unit like Frozen Banshee. Doomscreech is also worth mentioning. Corpulent Cadaver used to be good. Grinner is decent for factions, but at the end of the day, we move on to this faction, Dark Elves, which has Cold Art, which I mentioned earlier, but also quite a few other good rares. Mainly Painkeeper, who is really, really good because she can decrease the cooldown of all ally skills by 1 turn. You could use like 3 Painkeepers and they'll constantly just be using this ability. You pair them with someone that puts block damage on all of your allies, and you could just keep refreshing that ability, keeping people alive. She can be used for so much cheese in this game. You really want to keep her. You really, really want to keep multiple of her. One of the better rares in this game. Kael is also worth mentioning as the best starter champion because of his poisons and great wave clearing. He is going to help you out a ton at the beginning. Paragon can also be used for some cheese. He has a 2-turn cooldown, unkillable, which is really good for 2 turns. You can use him very, very effectively, but at the end of the day, you're probably not going to see him be used too much. Knight's Revenant has a couple decent rares. We have, first of all, Renegade. Renegade is incredibly good. She's kind of a mini Kymar. Kymar is one of the better legendaries in this game. Decreases the cooldown of all allied skills by 2 turns. Skill does not affect this champion or other champions that have the skills, so you can't stack 5 Renegades and have them refresh themselves all the time. This champion will also receive damage equal to 30% of their max HP. This will happen even if it kills this champion. She also has a couple other things if you want to read it, but really it's for this ability where she can be pretty damn strong. I know that Coffin Smasher might have some uses, but an Executioner hits somewhat hard, but we're going to move on to Dwarves. Dwarves, Master Butcher used to be used for cheese. I don't think he can be used anymore. Kurzad, I hear, is okay for a rare for a couple areas. I mean, factions mainly is where you're going to be using a lot of these rares. And there's a couple other worthwhile dwarf rares in here. Candleguard does some okay damage. There are a couple decent ones there, but no one that really stands out. Shadowkin doesn't really have anyone worth keeping. And then we move on to Sylvan Watchers, the final faction, and there's actually quite a few solid rares in here. I want to highlight Kirlak primarily. He's kind of cool. He has a decreased attack on his A1, not really too important, but that's not his main ability. Attack all enemies, places increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns. Not super important if you have someone that puts out the big version, but if you are pretty limited on your champions. Very, very good ability. Then he also, on a Fortune cooldown, places a Veil buff on all allies except the champion for 1 turn. Veil basically makes it so they can't be targeted and they take a bit less damage. But he also places a shield buff on all allies for 2 turns, equal to 20% of this champion's max HP. You want it to be this champion's max HP, so you can build him with HP and he'll save your squishy units even more than if it were their max HP. So this is a very solid ability. There are also 2 others that I want to mention in this faction, maybe even 3. First of all, Tree Sealed Knot is really solid. He has a revive 2 random allies with 25% HP and turn meter, 5 turn cooldown. Also places a shield buff on all revived allies for 2 turns, equal to 20% of their max HP. Not as good as if it was his max HP, but a 2 random allies for a rare revive is insane. He also can heal by 15% of their max HP and puts increased defense. He's surprisingly solid. Branch Arm Sarah is also decent. 3 turn hitter, heals the champion of their max HP for each hit. Attacks all enemies, has a chance of placing decreased attack on the opponents for 2 turns, and then places a shield buff on all allies equal to 20% of this champion's max HP for 2 turns. 3 turn cooldown. This is really solid for keeping your allies alive. And then places a strengthen buff. It's not the big version, but this is so hard to come by early on, for all allies for 2 turns, and then places provoke debuff on an enemy for 1 turn. He just helps you stay alive. It's really, really solid. I think there's also some other ones like Bowsmith's Flannan is worth a mention. He has a stun on his A1. He brings a decreased speed on all enemies and also an increased accuracy buff on all allies for 2 turns, and a team up with a random ally. Team ups are really good in this game. Chance of granting an anti-turn when he places a decreased speed with debuff on 3 or more enemies with their Shattered Knees skill. This one. He's really good too. And those are pretty much all of the rares that are worth keeping in this game. Obviously, I probably missed some, or there might be some that specialize in super niche areas or faction wars, but the ones that I mentioned are going to be the ones that you're going to find the most value out of, especially early game. Once you get into later game, you're going to be using mostly just Cold Heart and another Cold Heart. But at the end of the day, you're not going to reach that point unless you're spending or you've played for a while. So this will be very, very helpful early on. So while you're trying to save shards or build out your heroes, just keep these rares in mind and they might just save your ass one day. So thank you guys so much for watching. That's kind of everything I wanted to talk about. And make sure to like and subscribe if you would like. And that's it from me, Destin, signing out.